The masculine and feminine elements, exactly equal in balancing each other, are as essential to the maintenance of the equilibrium of the universe as positive and negative electricity, the centripetal and centrifugal forces, the laws of attraction which bind together all we know of this planet whereupon we dwell, and of the system in which we revolve. Likewise, too, in the great movement for women's equality, the great natural laws are at work in the workers. It is not natural to persist at a perpetual breakneck speed. At times progress requires its opposite, that one stop if only to contemplate one's next steps. My grandchildren professed that I was an expert storyteller, though Susan maintained that I could tangle chronologies worse than anybody she knew. But truth is more important than chronology, and when telling the story of this movement, one finds that the denouement of one story is merely the advent of another. The story of women's liberty, as so often told, typically begins in the midst of my trials as an isolated and overworked young mother, the disenfranchised daughter of a judge and the indignant wife of an abolitionist. I sat down to a tea party with a small group of women, Mary Ann McClintock, Jane Hunt, Martha Coffin Wright, and her sister, Lucretia Mott, once described as a regular barn-burning kind of woman, and how I poured out that day the torrent of my long-accumulating discontent with such vehemence and indignation that I stirred myself, as well as the rest of the party, to do and dare anything. We decided to hold a women's rights convention, wrote the call that evening, and published it in the Seneca County Courier the next day. 5 days later, in the oppressive July heat of 1848, we, the people of Seneca Falls and Waterloo, of Auburn and Rochester, of Mendon, Williamson, Galen, and Farmington, gathered in the Wesleyan Chapel of Seneca Falls to discuss the need for revolution. Our plans were made in haste, but they grew out of years of steadily increasing awareness of injustice, out of galling insult and oppressions both petty and severe that barred woman from taking her rightful place beside her brother in the great American experiment. But these days, my mind often returns to another Advent story, one perhaps more dear to a mother's heart, which took place a month after Christmas and inspired no greater tribute than my own private note to Susan B. Anthony, in which I said, "Where are you, Susan, and what are you doing? Your silence is truly appalling. Are you dead or married? Well, I have got the 6th edition of my admirable work. Another female child is born into the world." Last Sunday afternoon, Harriet Eaton Stanton, oh, the little heretic, thus to desecrate that holy day, opened her soft blue eyes on this mundane sphere. This 6th edition, with a 7th edition to follow, his sister 3 years later, kept me at home longer than I had planned. I may have launched a movement, but my ship remained firmly moored in harbor. Though I established myself as a founder and leader of the movement with the publication of articles in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, Amelia Bloomer's Lily, and Paulina Wright Davis's women's rights publication, The Una, and though I sent encouraging missives to instruct and comfort weary women warriors, I missed nearly all the yearly suffrage events, largely due to what I called my biennial clumsiness, which resulted in a house full of little Stantons. Their development fascinated me. I was determined to create exceptional offspring, unencumbered by the dark thraldom of religion or injustice. I loved beyond measure all my children. In Harriet, however, there were early signs that she was heir to my legacy. When Harriet was about 10, Sojourner Truth, quietly smoking her pipe, sat listening to my little Hattie read the morning paper. "Sojourner, can't you read?" Hattie asked. "Oh, no, honey," Sojourner responded with her characteristic wit. "I can't read little things like letters. I read big things, like men." From then on, Hattie began to see the possibilities of words and how they are forever wed to the greater world of action. Henry and I made our dining table a center of debate and insisted that our children hold their own in matters of politics, morality, history, and human rights. While Henry was in the midst of a challenging run for a New York State Senate, 5-year-old Gat looked upon his infant brother in his bath and said with great concern, "Mother, is the baby for or against father?" Now, before the little Stantons made their appearance in this world, I took my own turn as a child in Johnstown, New York. The daughter of Judge Daniel Cady, I learned the power of words as they built legal cages around women, robbing them of their property, their wages, their autonomy, and their self-respect. To gain my father's approval, I studied those little things, those words, to prove to him that I was as good as a boy. I studied them in English, in Greek, and in Latin. I chased them in school books and legal tomes and was clever enough to best the boys in Johnstown Academy and even to hold my own with my father's smug law students. But I could not convince my father that his clever daughter was as good as a boy. This helplessness in the face of a force I could not yet describe could not last forever. As Sojourner Truth ushered my daughter into a world of intellect deeper than little things like letters, I had my own guides. The first woman who modeled the writing life and the life of an active, irrepressible intellect was Emma Willard of Troy Female Seminary. She was not a political radical. She did not expect her students to change the world, but she did demand a place for us within it. Lucretia Mott further initiated me into a broader world. I met her in 1840 during my honeymoon voyage to England, where my husband was a delegate to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. She was a Quaker of the most radical variety, entirely devoted to equality, integrity, and truth. She claimed her birthright of equality, and with it, her obligation to publish the truth, which she did frequently, boldly, and to the intense mortification and consternation of many conservative souls. She was the first woman I ever saw preach a sermon. Whereas I spent long hours constructing each speech, the words flowed from her as if God Almighty spoke directly from her lips. This may very well have been true. Though she rejected the title, we called her Saint Lucretia, and even I am not heretic enough to discount it. Seek truth for your authority, Elizabeth, she told me. Never accept authority as your truth. And with those words, she shut the door on the cold Calvinism of my youth and invited me into a fullness of my own humanity. The 1848 Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments changed everything and nothing for me. I still had 3 little boys and 4 more little Stens, or as their father lovingly called them, miserable little underdeveloped vandals, waiting in the wings. After all, children may grow up in a heartbeat, but they take an eternity to do it. More often than I care to admit, I felt like a caged lioness pacing the floor between desk and cradle. I saw each child as a new addition in the book of my life. Later, I would see each book I produced as if it were my child. Whatever my medium of expression, I was always impatient for the next chapter to unfold. Then I met Susan B. Anthony. She was an abolitionist and involved in the temperance movement. An evangelist of the future, I preached to her the good news of the women's rights movement, and within no time, she experienced a conversion experience worthy of the burned-over district. In turning the intense earnestness and religious enthusiasm of this great-souled woman into this channel, I soon felt the power of the convert goading me forward to more untiring work. I had been brooding, not merely over my children, but over an outraged sense of injustice. Susan was a catalyst translating my thoughts into action. I met her in 1851. In 1852, we organized the New York State Women's Temperance Society with 500 women at our first meeting. I was the first president. In our very first year, I made the radical demand for the right to vote and the right to divorce. In our second year, I was voted right out of the organization. But we were undaunted. The year after that, in the winter of 1853 to 1854, Susan organized a campaign of 60 women who collected 10,000 signatures for women's rights. It took me 2 months to research and write that document. Also in 1854, we founded the New York State Suffrage Society, of which I was president. That same year, I spoke before the New York State Legislature. This speech, before my father's peers, was a realization of my dream since childhood when he told me that my plan to cut out all the odious woman-hating laws in his law books with a knife would accomplish nothing, but to speak before the legislature might change the legal status of womankind. Before I read the speech in the Capitol, Father asked me to read it to him. I trembled, more before that audience of one than I ever did when I stood before thousands. Would to God, I said, you could understand the burning indignation that fills woman's soul when she turns over the pages of your statute books and sees there how like feudal barons you freemen hold your women. Would that you could know the humiliations she feels for her sex when she thinks of all the beardless boys in your law offices learning these ideas of one-sided justice, taking their first lessons in contempt for all womankind, being indoctrinated into the incapacities of their mothers and the lordly, absolute rights of man over all women, children, and property, and to know that these are to be our future presidents, judges, husbands, and fathers. In sorrow we exclaim, alas, for that nation whose sons bow not in loyalty to woman. 6 years later, I spoke before the state legislature again. But by that time, my father had died, and my youngest child, Robert Livingston Stanton, had been born. It was time for me to move forward. We sold our house in Seneca Falls and moved to New York City. In all those years, Susan B. Anthony had been my good angel, preventing me from narrow family selfishness. Time and time again, in the midst of mischievous boys and crying babies, she would arrive on my doorstep to demand a speech, an action, a letter, a theory, a petition, a campaign. Susan, my whole heart is in the movement, but my hands belong to my family, I would protest, unimpressed and unforgiving of all mortal failings. She would take the children in hand and set me to work. When the speeches were written off, she'd go again to share my words with the world. I forged the thunderbolts, and she fired them. Eventually, I learned that to escape Susan B. Anthony's demands, one must leave the country, which I do. From time to time, it worked way too heavily, though she always managed to call me back home. How lovely a life I had with my books, my children, my gardens, and my big St. Bernard dog, but Susan was relentlessly disinterested in leisure. Oh well. I do believe that I developed into much more of a woman under her jurisdiction than if left to myself reading novels in an easy chair. With my excellent housekeeper, Amelia Willard, firmly established in our family, my last baby weaned, and my household moved to New York City, I entered a more active stage of life. Susan once carried my words into the world, leaving me behind with a baby. Now, I too followed my words into the broader world. These were the Civil War years, a thrilling and dangerous time for all of us. Like so many women and girls, we scraped lint and rolled bandages. We also founded the Women's National Loyal League and organized the largest petition drive in the nation to that date, collecting 400,000 signatures demanding an end to slavery and proclaiming that there can never be a true peace in this republic until the civil and political rights of all citizens of African descent and all women are practically established. The end of the war did not provide relief from conflict. In 1865, we petitioned Congress for universal suffrage. In 1866, we founded the American Equal Rights Association, and I became the first woman to run for Congress. 1867 was the year of our controversial campaign for universal suffrage in Kansas with George Francis Train. Though many regretted our allegiance with a man they saw as an unforgivably self-promoting racist, I could not resist his help and sympathy. When Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass alike voiced that women must wait their turn for suffrage, Train gave us money to start our own publication in which to speak our own truth. This was a revolution, a magazine that lasted 2 years, but what years? Emblazoned in our first masthead were the words, "The true republic, men their rights and nothing more. Women their rights and nothing less." In 1869, we founded the National Woman Suffrage Association. I was president of the NWSA for all 21 years of its existence. Also in 1869, I began traveling as a speaker on the Lyceum Lecture Circuit, taking my words and ideals to America from California redwood forests to the shores of the Mississippi. I spoke to schools and prisons, before churches and colleges, in rustic prairie towns and rooms unfinished, unfurnished, and unlit, as well as in great eastern cities before audiences of thousands. often traveling quite alone by railway, wagon, sled, and donkey cart. I carried the message of women's rights across the nation for 12 years. My speeches imagined a better world for our girls and challenged the abuses and indignities of loveless marriages. I called for suffrage and self-sovereignty, for a woman's right to claim her own wages, seize her own destiny, plan her own pregnancies, and to be free from what your generation has learned to call marital rape. For 8 months a year, I kept up an exhausting pace until finally it was time again for a new chapter. 1880 seemed a natural end to so many things and the beginning of others. I was exhausted from my years on the road and ready to settle into a quieter life with my family. Younger suffragists encouraged me to keep a journal, a practice I began on my 65th birthday in November of 1880. My first entry mourned the loss of Lucretia Mott, whose wise counsel and unyielding integrity had guided me from the start. She died one day before my 65th birthday.